Hey there. So in this video, I'm going to be introducing a new metric that's going to be very useful for PPC managers who are always concerned about how much to spend in which platform in such a way that it will give them incremental returns in terms of profit or in terms of revenue. So this metric is called elasticity of ROAS. And you might have heard or come across the word elasticity if you are somewhat familiar with some aspects of economics. And I hope you are, because economics is so fundamental to everything we do in performance marketing. But this particular metric, elasticity of ROAS, has probably not been used so much, and I'm a bit surprised. But when I came across this concept and I went through the ideas behind it, it's actually fundamentally very simple. But in order to arrive at the concept, you have to bear with me as I explain some economic concepts and some equations, as you can see in front of me, in front of you in the screen. I'll walk you through some of these concepts, but by the time we arrive at the actual definition of elasticity of ROAS, we'll see that it's not that hard and it's very, very actionable and practicable. So let's dive right in without further ado. So we are looking at the equation for sales volume, and this is trying to establish a relationship between advertising spend and volume. So as you might understand that there is some sort of a direct relationship here, a direct proportional relationship between advertising volume, or rather advertising spend and sales volume, and that makes sense. This is not profit, this is not profitability that we're talking about. We're talking directly about sales volume. So you expect that as advertising spends increase, that there's going to be an increasing tendency in sales. But this effect is not going to be linear, which is precisely why you see that in the advertising spend, we also have a power in small a, and this is basically called the elasticity of advertising, as you see here. And this is a value which is not an integer. It varies from 0 to 1. So this is basically serving two purposes. Firstly, it is giving you that effect of non-linearity that I said, because this is essentially the concept of diminishing returns being used here. So if you keep on increasing advertising spends, you don't expect sales to be increasing in the same proportion. So this is basically elasticity of advertising. Then you also have another constant here, which is called the scaling constant, which is K here. So this is basically going to give you that unique relationship between that increase of spend and sales volume, because this is obviously not going to be just equal to a to the power of a. So this is called the scaling constant. And once you have that, now you're moving towards profit. So Z is basically the net profit. And as you can see, this has been given by the very standard formula that it's the selling price, or the actual AOV, you can say, and you subtract from it the variable cost, and then multiply it by the sales volume, and again subtract the advertising cost in order to arrive at the net profit. So P minus V is nothing but therefore the profit margin. So as you can see here, M is the profit margin. By the way, profit margin can be expressed in two formats, in dollar format or currency format, and also in percentage. So this is the currency format, the simple number format. So M times Q minus A gives you your net profit. Now comes another version of the equation, which is to actually use this formula that we had established earlier. Q is equal to K A to the power A. So this has been sort of transposed put into this equation, and therefore we get it in the forms of K and A and M. So this is up to this, let's stop and understand what's going to happen therefore from here on. So we have a net profit which has been defined in terms of advertising spend, in terms of a scaling constant, and the profit margin. So you understand that it's not going to take very long before we start arriving at a relationship between ROAS, because ROAS, as we know, for instance, a break-even ROAS is simply the inverse of profit margin in percentage format. So it's not going to take it's not a big leap from here, right? So we are trying to establish the relationship between two sets of variables. One is the profit and advertising spend, or rather the effect of advertising spend on profit, and second, the effect of ROAS, or advertising efficiency on profit. So profit will have to be looked at from two different angles. So let's dive back now. So DZDA or DZDA, whichever way you spell it or pronounce it. So this is now a little bit of calculus. This is called differential calculus, and if you are familiar with it, if you have some sort of tech background or some whatever exposure to mathematics, you will have come across this. Otherwise, this is nothing but just taking ratios and between changes of two variables. Okay, so you're taking the ratio of the change in net profit over the change in advertising spend. So this is, there is actually a formula for it, and when you take DZDA, you're just gonna have to work on anything that's actually dependent on A. So here we only have these two terms, which are A containing terms. So A comes down to the middle, down to the bottom here. It becomes A minus one, and this becomes one. The rest is just constant, so they just remain the way they are. So you can just look up the formula if you're interested in it, but it's not super crucial. But the point is that you have to, take this ratio DZDA, or it's not exactly a ratio, but mathematically it's the differential of net profit with respect to the change in with respect to the change in DA, change in advertising spend. So using that, why we are doing it, we are actually trying to arrive at, whenever we do something like this, taking a differential, and this is basically called a first order differential, and we do this, and then we equate the result to zero. We do that to arrive at a threshold value. Okay, so there are concepts like maxima and minima. So we are actually trying to understand optimal value of advertising spend. And in fact, this is the higher optimal value. This is the maximum value that we are trying to arrive at. And as you can see, that's been given by A star here. Okay, so solving for this particular equation that we get by equating the output of DZDA to zero gives us our optimal advertising spend. So you just transpose the equation, just move things around on either side of the equation, you arrive at this value basically, amk to the power of 1 upon a minus 1, small a minus 1. So this is giving us the optimal advertising spend. Now the optimal advertising spend simply means that beyond this point, you're not going to be profitable. Okay, so you understand what we are trying to get at and why this is related to incrementality. We are basically trying to establish a universal formula using which we will be able to know that, okay, this is the optimal level of advertising spend beyond which we'll not be getting incremental value. Okay, and this is something we are getting in terms of very fundamental things. We're getting in terms of constants, first of all the elasticity constant, and then the scaling constant, and just the marginal, the profit margin rather. So the profit margin, as we have said, is already very directly related to ROAS, right? So you already have a very clear understanding of the direction that we're moving to. Now, if we are to take the actual formula of ROAS from this is going to be nothing but profit upon advertising spend. Just to clarify here, the approach that has been taken here is to take ROAS not in terms of revenue, but in terms of profit. Okay, so you are in the numerator, you're not using profit revenue, but rather using profit. So it's profit upon advertising spend, and then you just plug in the values that you've got previously, and and this is the value that you get. So MKA to the power a small a minus 1 minus 1. So that's your ROAS. So once again, in terms of, since this is of course a real ROAS and not a break-even ROAS or something, you obviously have to take into account the advertising spend. But as you can see that this is only in terms of, the only variable here is the advertising spend, because your profit margin and your your small a and small k, all of these are constants. So you've got the optimal advertising spend in terms of profit margin, and the ROAS in terms of profit margin and the advertising spend. So you've got these two equations now, and this is how you're going to have to actually approach this. So you can now establish relationships between the ROAS and the advertising spend. And let's actually walk through this curve now. And this is going to bring us closer to our required metric. So there are two things being drawn here. The black curve is essentially the ROAS curve. So this is how the ROAS, as you can see, as the ad spend is increasing, as the ad spend is increasing, you can see that there's a drop in the ROAS, right? So this is an expected trend. This is exactly what we sort of kind of defined in this equation as well. That there's in terms of sales volume, there's also going to be a drop, and therefore there's also going to be a drop in the ROAS because the ad spend is also increasing. So this equation, this curve basically gives the inverse relationship between ad spend and ROAS, which we are all familiar with. It's basically because of diminishing law of the law of diminishing returns. On the other hand, this ROAS star and this A star are basically related to the optimal levels of spending. So the ROAS that is corresponding to the optimal level of advertising spend that we saw here, this is the formula for it. The corresponding ROAS for that optimal level of advertising spend is ROAS star. Okay, so this yellow box, therefore, this is basically comprised of 4 points. See how it has been drawn. It's 0 0 at the origin. It is A star 0. It is 0 ROAS star, and therefore and then finally A star ROAS star. These are the 4 points that are actually um, this square is bounded by these 4 points. So this therefore represents the total profit, the net profit. Okay, that's getting generated for this level of advertising spend and this level of ROAS, which is we know is basically the optimal level. And why is it optimal? We can actually now graphically show it. We can draw this curve which corresponds to the DZDA curve that we saw. Okay, and you can see that it's a graph that it's going, that it has a decreasing trend. From its very uh, very structure, we can actually see that, and that it's a nonlinear curve. It's a curvilinear. It's a curved plot basically between ROAS and DZDA. So let's see how DZDA is actually behaving. It's behaving in a very similar way to the way ROAS and ad spend was behaving, right? So this is nothing but basically the marginal ROAS, okay? Because at every point, if you look at how this graph is moving, at every point you will see that as this graph is increasing, the ROAS is also decreasing, okay? So and you can see that this is passing through the A star, which is basically the optimal advertising spend. Now, this simply means that beyond this point, as the graph is actually moving now towards the negative zone, right? So what it therefore implies is that if you move your shift your advertising spend beyond A star, you're going to get not incremental effects. In fact, you're going to get, the effect is going to be negative. Your net profit is actually going to decrease, okay, because you're spending beyond incremental zones basically. So this is therefore a very useful thing, and this graph is also passing through, as you can see, the point A star ROAS star, meaning that it's the optimal point, and this is the level at which you should be really spending. Anything less than this means that you're leaving money on the table, but anything beyond this means that you're going beyond the zone of incrementality. Okay, so that's why this is the optimal zone. So the point here is therefore passing through the ROAS curve. This is the ROAS that you should be looking at. This is the ad spend that you should be looking to spend at. So you basically not, the profit that you're going to make, is actually given by the area of the square, okay, and not anything else. So the profit simply is calculated by multiplying ad spend with ROAS, right? So that's essentially how you're going to arrive at this particular profit. So that's the definitions, and the graph. So this is now basically how the variation is being explained. So like I mentioned just a couple of minutes back, that the net profit is basically depending on two factors, right? It's depending on the ad spend, and it's depending on the ROAS. So the ad spend, or rather the change in the ad spend and the change in ROAS, tend to have very opposite reactions, right? So when you increase the ad spend, if you consider the ROAS part constant, or you just leave that out, in isolation, if you consider just advertising spend, with an increase in advertising spend, you will have a tendency of the profit increasing. On the other hand, if you consider only the ROAS change, you'll see that the ROAS tends to drop when you're increasing the advertising spend, right? So therefore, there's also a net drop in effect. Because of the drop in effect in ROAS, you'll have a drop in effect in the in case of net profit. So these are two competing things, two opposite things moving in opposite directions, and that's why the net profit can be, or the change in the net profit rather, the delta Z can be represented as the multiplication of A delta ROAS and delta ROAS multiplied by delta A. Okay, I hope this makes sense. This is just a mathematical formulation of the concept that I just explained. Now let's look at this graphically. So we already have seen the ROAS curve between ROAS and ad spend. And remember, once again, ROAS has been defined as profit by advertising spend. So don't get confused when I say, for instance, the total profit is multiplied by, is simply ROAS multiplied by ad spend. That just is from definition. That's how we have defined ROAS in our case. And this is a useful way to define ROAS, as you will see. So let's actually look at how the change is happening. We saw one static case, right? But let's now look at a separate case where the advertising spend has actually increased from A star to A2. Okay, so what's going to be the net impact of this? So we see that advertising spend has obviously increased, right? So this yellow box that was there, which was defining the profit previously, has now been replaced by this blue box, this light blue box starting from the origin to A2. And ROAS has also dropped from ROAS star to ROAS 2, right? Because like we said, as the advertising spend increases, there's one impact, which is this light shaded, this particular small rectangle here, which is shaded in light blue, which is giving you the impact of the ad spend on profit, right? So that's why you're multiplying ROAS 2 with the difference in between these two ad spends, A2 minus A star. On the other hand, the impact of ROAS is the declining one, which is the downward pressure on the the change in the net profit. So that's why you're multiplying A star. So this is the vertical line here, and you're multiplying it with the changes in the ROAS. So ROAS 2 minus ROAS star. As you understand, ROAS 2 minus ROAS star is going to be a negative value, right? That's precisely why I said that there's an opposing effect. These two things are moving in the opposite directions: the effect of ROAS and the effect of ad spend on net profit. So this actually brings us to the concept of elasticity. So now we have seen that these are two competing things. So when you try to understand or analyze the effect of two competing things, one of the easiest ways of understanding the combined effect is to take a ratio. Okay, and that is precisely what actually brings us to this. So we are taking the elasticity of ROAS as the defining metric for understanding the incremental effect or the effect on incrementality of profit. So percentage of delta ROAS divided by percentage of delta advertising spend is our elasticity of ROAS, and that has the impact, or that has the capability of explaining the change that it will have on the change of net profit. So at maximum profit, A star elasticity is -1. Once again, why is this? It's going to be 1 because at maximum profit, the percentage of change in ROAS is completely been mitigated by the change in advertising spend, right? So there's really nothing else going on. There's no net impact happening. So that's why the ratio is 1. But it's -1 because the ROAS is always in the negative direction, right? As you increase advertising spend, your ROAS is always a decreasing side. So that effect has been represented by this minus sign here. The elasticity is between 0 and -1. So let's take another case now, and this is going to be probably the most common case as long as your campaigns are profitable, and that's because you have still room for additional ad spend. So anything that is in any value of this elasticity that is between 0 and -1, as a PPC manager that you should have more room to increase your ad spends. And of course, I'm talking about this at an aggregate level. Try to understand this, of course, and try to visualize it from a campaign level or at any level at all that you can do this sort of measurement. Okay, so this measurement is not restricted only at an account level or at a very generic, broader view, but even at a granular level, you can apply this. But make sure that you are making the calculations correctly, because ultimately that will impact your decisions. Elasticity being less than 1 means that there's no incremental addition to profit for any additional ad spend beyond what's there already. So ad spend, in fact, should go in the opposite direction, meaning that it should be reduced. So there you go. We have arrived at an elasticity value, at a metric that will actually give you the opportunity to take decisions just based on the value of that metric regarding ad spend, and that is directly linked to the concept of incrementality. So let's actually look at a real data set, a very simple data set This is giving you sales numbers, advertising spends numbers, net profit, ROAS, and then we are going to calculate the elasticity. This is something that we are going to end up calculating. Okay, so let's actually look at what's happening. So there are the different sales values across different periods. We have the corresponding ad spends, and obviously the net profit is simply the difference between these two, the spend and the revenue. And then you can have the ROAS as well. The ROAS is defined as the profit over ad spend. Remember, that's how it's been defined here. So as you can see that the ROAS is actually constantly decreasing. But whether or not you should be increasing your ad spend is something that you have to decide, right? So if you just decide it on the basis of ROAS, you'll probably see that, hey, the ROAS is having a decreasing effect. It's actually decreasing. So I should not be increasing the ad spend probably. But you will see that the elasticity is something that you should actually keep in mind. So as long as the elasticity is less than, or rather between 0 and -1, remember, then you should be able to increase ad spends further. Okay, so that's why the elasticity is getting lesser and lesser. As you can see, it is approaching -1, but the moment it starts getting below -1 is the moment that you should be deciding not to increase ad spends more, and you should be reducing ad spend if it starts going below -1. Okay, so -1 is therefore the cutoff point, is the threshold point below which you will not be able to increase ad spends further. So that is the whole thing, and the elasticity here has been calculated in exactly the same way that I've defined it. You just take the percentage difference of the ROAS for every period over and take the ratio by dividing that with the percentage change of the advertising spend for that same period corresponding to the previous period. So that is how the elasticity has been defined. Okay, so just the important point to keep in mind here is that the impact on profit due to the change in efficiency is always in the opposite direction due to the impact, the opposite direction of the impact that is happening due to the change in advertising spend. So these two opposing trends have to be met with a clearer understanding, and based on that, you'll be able to take decisions about advertising spends and whether or not that's being incremental. So I hope this was useful. This is something that is very actionable, very practicable. It's a new metric that I've introduced. It's not something that I will be using very commonly. But if you do use it, I think you can see how easily it's calculated and how simply you can actually arrive at decisions regarding incrementality without getting into very complicated calculations, third-party tools, and all of that. So I hope all of this was clear. If not, just leave a comment. If you need any assistance in implementing it, do let me know. You can reach out to me as well, not a problem. And yeah, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.